This is by far the creepiest and spookiest experience I've ever had. This happened at the school I went to in the Philippines, which was a local Catholic one, but not that kind of strict. To describe where it happened, my classroom that time was at the end of the hallway located at the first floor. Also, it was across our mini library where our kind librarian sits behind the door. Beside that library were the bathrooms for girls and boys. The girls' bathroom is bigger with 3 cubicles inside of it. The boys' one was just an entire bathroom without the cubicles. It was way back in 2003 when I was in the 3rd grade. It happened during the summertime, around 2 or 3 o'clock in the afternoon. We had an ongoing class at that time in the classroom when I excused myself to go to the bathroom. I walked across the hallway and reached the girls' bathroom. Just a brief description of how it looked. When you enter, there was a big dirty scratched mirror on the wall which would welcome you in. Beneath that was a clogged and dirty sink. Besides the sinks were the cubicles, the 3 of them. These were made of soft aluminum material, and the locks on the doors were always broken. This was an important detail of the cubicles. When I entered the bathroom, I was the only one in the area. No other students inside the boys' bathroom or even the other cubicles. All the doors on the cubicles were wide open, and I'm usually the scaredy cat girl, so I went inside the first one. Since the locks were broken, I just held the door while peeing, so if anyone would enter, they'd know I was there. As I was finishing my business, a sudden gush of wind entered the bathroom, and I felt someone. It felt like a presence entered the bathroom. I waited for that someone to enter one of the cubicles, but nothing happened. I was clueless, and I didn't think of it as a ghost at first, but I heard the faucet in the 3rd cubicle open, and the water started flowing. I, without thinking too much, peeped below the cubicles. There was no one, no feet, nothing, not anything. All I saw was water flowing, and I freaked out too much, so I hurriedly fixed my uniform. When I was trying to open the door, it wouldn't budge. Remember, the lock was broken, so just a little touch would help it open, but it was not moving at all. I was so hysterical that I went punching the door so it had dents in it. I was screaming, crying, and genuinely scared. I tried kicking the door, but it just wouldn't move. After screaming louder, my throat was getting sore until my teacher and the librarian hurriedly went to me. They heard me screaming and ran to my aid, opening the door, mind you, without any force. I was dumbfounded, and they asked me what happened. So I told them everything. They just stared at each other and gave me a faint but worried laugh and helped me get back to class. It was the scariest feeling I'd ever felt because I felt so helpless. I remember stories of other students seeing ghosts and such in that school. Some say that school was initially rice plains where salvaged bodies would usually get thrown. So I guess that might be able to explain it if it's all true. 18 years has passed, and that memory is still as clear as a glass. I never minded going to school, but after that day, I never wanted to go back again. It was a hot summer night, and a group of friends had decided to spend the evening exploring an abandoned hospital on the outskirts of town. As they made their way through the decrepit building, they couldn't help but feel like they were being watched. But they brushed it off, thinking it was just their imaginations. As they reached the 4th floor, they heard a weird whisper. It was the sound of a child's voice, pleading for help. The group froze in fear, and one of them shone their flashlight towards the sound. There, in the corner of the room, was a small girl in a tattered white dress. The friends approached the girl, thinking that perhaps someone had abandoned their child in this hospital. But as they got closer, they realized that something was terribly wrong. The girl's skin was a sickly gray color, and her eyes were pitch black. And then, with a sudden burst of energy, the girl lunged at them. The friends tried to run, but the girl was so fast. and as they looked back, they saw she was no longer alone. A group of ghostly apparitions had appeared, and they were chasing after the friends with vengeance in their eyes. The group ran for what felt like hours, but they couldn't shake their pursuers, and then suddenly, they saw a bright light at the end of the hallway. They ran towards it, hoping that it would lead them to safety. As they burst through the door, they found themselves outside the hospital again. They turned back to look at the building, and in the darkness, there was no one there anymore. Upon investigating the area a little longer outside, they discovered an old, deserted playground. The friends never spoke of that night again, but they knew that they'd come face to face with something paranormal, and they knew that they would never venture inside of an abandoned building again. When I was maybe 4 years old, my family, me, mom, dad, and 2 older brothers, lived in a trailer. A single wide, 1 bedroom on each side, with a living room, kitchen, and bath in the middle. I only have 1 memory from that trailer. A little backstory about me and my dad. He would often wake up in the middle of the night and have trouble getting back to sleep. He'd have a bowl of cereal and read a book to help him go back to sleep. Sometimes he would whistle. He was really good at whistling, and I would wake up sometimes in the middle of the night to hear him. It was a special time for the 2 of us, as I would get up to have some cereal with him when he was doing that. One night, I woke up to hear whistling. I thought it was my dad, so I smiled to myself, got up, and started walking. As I passed through the living room into the kitchen, I saw a man pacing in the hall outside of my parents' bedroom. He was very handsome, like an old cowboy movie star from the shows my dad would watch. He was wearing jeans and a red and gray western type of shirt. He was whistling, just like my dad, but I'd never seen this man before. He looked at me and smiled. Somehow, I felt no fear, but I was confused. What he said to me still rings in my head as if it happened yesterday instead of 35 years ago. He said to me, "Don't worry, baby girl. Your daddy's gonna be just fine." I panicked and ran past the man into my parents' bedroom. Thinking back on it, I don't recall brushing against him as I passed him even though the hall was very narrow. I ran to my dad's bedside and jumped up, climbing onto him. I kept asking him if he was okay because I was terrified. I was a daddy's girl to the extreme back then. He woke up coughing and sputtering. Soon after, we found out that my dad had severe sleep apnea, that he would often stop breathing when he slept. I tried to tell my parents about the man I'd seen, but they thought it was just a dream and didn't think much of it. Years later, I was looking through some old photo albums with my grandmother, Dad's mom. As she turned the page, I saw a picture of the same man I'd seen in that trailer years ago. I told my grandmother that I'd seen this man in the house with me when I was little. She looked at me and smiled with grief in her eyes. "No, honey," she said. "There's no way you could have seen this man. That's my first husband, your daddy's dad. He died when your dad was just a bit younger than you are now." It took me another year to finally realize that my grandfather had been there that night. His whistling caused me to wake up my dad because he had stopped breathing in his sleep. My dad is gone now, but I'm comforted knowing he's with my grandfather, who never stopped taking care of his son. This took place October 1st in 2021. We would go to Las Vegas frequently because we only lived a few hours away in California, and we headed there for a typical excursion. I enjoyed trying new food or staying at a different hotel each time. Over the years, we've stayed at nearly every hotel on the Strip. Some of these hotels are decades old, dating back to the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, so we've understandably witnessed the occasional strange noise, smell, or bump in the night. But the strangest thing that's ever happened was at the newest hotel addition, Resorts World. Resorts World opened in June of 2021, and I was excited to stay there because it was genuinely new for both of us. It was also our first time traveling post-pandemic, so we splurged a little and stayed at the Conrad side of the hotel. This was marketed as an affordable luxury hotel. It was a beautiful room with all new technology embedded into the room to make things more convenient and fun. I couldn't have been more pleased with the room at the time. We then decided to unpack and explore the resort downstairs a bit. We did some gambling, ate dinner, and then I headed to my room upstairs to get ready for bed. While I did that, my boyfriend stayed downstairs at the resort to do some more gambling and drinking. He usually stays up a lot later than me, so this was pretty normal. While I was laying in bed on my phone, I started to hear noises. Most of the noises were common hotel noises like pipes in the wall, bumps from the floor above, and even plumbing when another room starts their shower. Standard stuff really. But some of the noises weren't normal. Mainly, I could hear creaking from the bathroom, as if someone was in there standing or walking. It was almost like they were standing at the sink getting ready for bed, moving around like a normal person. I didn't really notice it though until the sound started to creep towards me, leaving the bathroom and moving into the bedroom. It sounded like footsteps coming towards me, but they were slow and uneven. I looked up from my phone and didn't see anything. I reasoned with myself that it was nothing, but something was off. It just felt off. Like I said before, we come to Las Vegas frequently, and we've stayed at nearly every hotel. But I can tell you, I've never felt this creeped out. Nothing like this. Even though my mind was being rational, it's just the floor, it's nothing. My heart rate was going up, and I had a bad feeling in the pit of my stomach. I couldn't control it. It was like something was in there with me, giving me a terrible feeling. I stared into the darkness for a few minutes, and I could still hear the steps coming closer. I was staring right at it, but there was nothing there. They were moving so slowly, and they were approaching the foot of the bed. I could feel the goosebumps on my arm, and I couldn't even blink. The footsteps stopped at the foot of the bed, and then the room fell eerily quiet, completely silent. But whatever it was still there. It was just at the foot of my bed, standing there. Was it watching me? What was its intention? My phone was frozen in my hands, and I didn't even want to look away. I was so afraid, and I didn't even know why. I don't know how much time passed with me just staring in an empty, silent hotel room, but eventually I texted my boyfriend, "Hey, can you come up to bed now? I'm getting spooked in the room by myself." He responded, "Okay." Texting him and knowing he was on his way gave me some comfort, and I tried to get my courage back and calm down. I could hear the common hotel sounds again, and that was comforting too. Perhaps the thing left while I distracted myself. When my boyfriend came up to the room, he teased me for getting spooked. We had a quick laugh and he got ready for bed. I felt better and mostly forgot about what happened. I think we both agreed the noises were just because the hotel was new and probably hasn't been lived in very much. However, one thing we both feared in every Las Vegas hotel was a break-in, so my boyfriend put his giant hydro flask water bottle in front of the entry door. It was a safety precaution. We did this at every hotel so that if someone was trying to sneak in, which happens a lot in Las Vegas, they would knock over the loud water bottle and startle us awake. Finally, we both fell asleep. I was fast asleep when something jolted me awake. It was my boyfriend thrashing out of the bed, throwing the covers back. He was yelling, "Hello? Who's there?" He rushed to his feet and headed straight for the entry door. I was still half asleep and asked him what was going on. I was squinting because the room was very bright now, but my boyfriend looked pretty distraught and didn't answer. He went to the bathroom, checked behind the door, checked behind the closet, checked behind the couch area because it was really obvious that something had spooked him. "What happened?" I asked. "The lights turned on," he said. "Did you turn them on?" "No." "What do you mean?" "Maybe you bumped the switch in your sleep." "No." All the lights came on. Something, somehow, had triggered all the lights in our hotel room to turn on in the middle of the night. The bathroom, the bedroom, the little hallway in front of the door, everything had come on. What could have possibly switched on all these lights at once? We sat in confusion for a few moments, then tried to think clearly. Did someone try to break into our room? No, the stuff in the front of the door hadn't been moved, and the water bottle was still standing upright. Was there a master button you could press that turned on everything and it got touched on by accident? No, that couldn't have been it either. There were two separate master buttons, one for the bedroom and one for the bathroom. Was it maybe a wiring issue? After all, it was a new hotel. Maybe that sort of thing happens. We decided to call the front desk and ask. We weren't sure what to even say to the clerk on the phone, so we just told her all of our lights had turned on and woke us up, and that we hadn't pressed any light switches. She sounded pretty confused herself, and not that she could have done anything, but we asked if she wanted to send someone up to take a look at it. At this point, it was 3 or 4 in the morning, so we said no. She said okay and took note of our call and wrote down the issue. We said goodbye, hung up, and sat in silence for a while. Now we were both creeped out, but we did our best to go back to sleep. Nothing else happened, even during the witching hour of the night. But as you can imagine, we laid in bed truly puzzled about why this all happened. During all the times of our stay in Las Vegas, we'd experienced nothing like this, and we never even had an intruder in our room. We were frightened, to say the least, but we were curious as well, as we didn't know exactly what was going on, or if anyone had been there in the first place. We finally woke up and decided to immediately check out of the room after packing up all of our items. Although we were excited to stay in this luxury side of the hotel, this wasn't worth the price. The next day, we talked about what happened, but we couldn't come to any definite conclusions. To this day, I'm still very puzzled by it, and I think about it quite often. The front desk never contacted us to tell us how the issue was resolved either. It may very well be that the new hotel was still working out its wiring. But what were those eerie footsteps coming towards me in the middle of the night? Was a phantom messing with us? I wish I remembered the room number so I can request not to stay in that particular room again, just in case. As you can tell, I truly don't trust that place anymore, and I think it's rightfully so. But what makes me wonder the most is exactly what those footsteps were coming towards me. And who was it standing at the edge of the bed, watching me sleep?
This isn't exactly a horrifying story, so don't get too disappointed if you're not terrified. For background, I'm a 15-year-old Irish fella called Ross. I go to school in Ireland, and I'm now in my 3rd year. At the start of the 2nd year, I knew another guy who joined the school. I was in charge of showing him around, and we'd been good friends ever since. He's Portuguese, and his name is Tiago. I'll call him Tig for this story. His school bag is fairly small, and it's a bright red bag that you'll notice from far away. He's a bit shorter than me, and his hair is quite short and brown in color. This will all become important momentarily. One day, I was upstairs in school, and it was break time, so I went to join my group's usual spot. I turned the corner and saw Tig walking along the hallway. This was weird because at the distance I was from him, I would have seen him come up the stairs. I really didn't think much of it at the time. I sped up to catch up to him, and there was another corner coming up. He rounded it out, and I followed suit behind him, except he wasn't there. There was a staircase going back down and 2 bathrooms, one for a guy and one for a girl, but no Tig. Considering how close I was behind him, he would have had to sprint towards and then jump down the stairs or jog into the bathroom. If he went for the stairs, I would have heard him, so I figured he must have been in the bathroom, or so I thought he would be. So what did I do? I sat at the bench and waited. To my surprise, Tig was the first other person in our group to arrive. He rounded the corner and left his bag down. The realization hit me so hard. He wasn't in the bathroom. I asked him if he'd already been up there, to which he said he hadn't, and he had no reason to lie. Now I know what you're thinking. It was someone else. First of all, the person I saw looked the exact same as my friend from the back. Second of all, no one else in the school has that bag. Third, the only place the person could have gone without sprinting down the stairs, which I probably would have catched a glimpse of anyway, would be the bathroom. No one came out of the bathroom that I didn't see enter it. Finally, my friend is a fairly distinct character. Not many people have the same body build as him. Like I said at the start, it's not exactly terrifying, but I do believe it to be something that wasn't normal. I'm from Indiana, which is a quiet Midwest state in the USA. Nobody really thinks much of it, as we're generally seen as a boring state with nothing much to do. Well, outside the small town of Ocean, I had my thrills. My mother alleges that when I was a toddler, I would point at corners of a room and say, "old man," which I don't remember. A few years later, my grandmother passed away, and I finally saw a photograph of my grandfather. He passed away long before I was ever a thought. I said to my mother that he was the old man, which I do still remember. As a side note, my other grandparents had a weird statue of a cowboy called Card Shark. I was so terrified of this statue and would say the old man towards it. The resemblance was dubious, but nevertheless, it was part of a story when I was younger. Over the first 20 years of my life, I lived at home with my parents in one of the oldest houses in our county, built around 1865. We had a hallway on the main floor, which I always had the creeps walking by, and the stairway was unnerving to say the least. I would often hear noises, and my parents would tell me stories of things that they would say or hear. By the time I was 14, I was starting to doubt that the house had something off about it, and almost as if it was meant to prove me wrong, I had my first weird incident. In September of 2005, I recall hearing a recorded message on our telephone. The voice was blood-curdling, very gravelly, somewhat metallic, and sounded like a person with throat cancer. They said, 5 years toll. The number was unlisted, and it came in at 9:45 p.m. What's even weirder is no one remembered hearing the phone ring. I experienced a nightmare about it a few days later, and that was the beginning of it all. I always sleep with a fan, especially now, because the white noise usually helps me fall asleep. Well, on April 6th, it was cold, and I decided to keep the fan off. Around midnight, I awakened to a frightening white apparition of what appeared to be a man glaring down at me by my bedside. In a second, I was able to deduce this before my covers went over my head. I'd heard of sleep paralysis before, and my mind was panicking trying to reason with what I just witnessed. Just as I was assured that I was experiencing sleep paralysis and hallucinating, the experience grew worse. The entire second story of our old house had original hardwood floors, and I heard footsteps go from my bedside to what I believed to be the other room. This was not sleep paralysis. This was something far more sinister. I was frozen, unable to bring myself out from under the covers to turn on my lamp. A few minutes passed by, and the slow, creepy footsteps returned to what I believed to be the foot of my bed. Then, I heard something I'll never forget. The apparition let out a quiet, not exactly mean-spirited, growl, like an old man sort of growl if ever there was one. That was the end of that experience. I awakened to see the apparition again in September of that year, but since it was in front of a window where I could see car lights from, I shook it off as just that. It didn't happen again until November 21st of that year. I even remember the dream I was having. I was driving a red convertible Ford Thunderbird through a desert, and an unknown passenger in the front seat made the growl I heard back in April. My eyes shot open, and to my horror, I witnessed a white apparition walking briskly up the staircase beside my bed. I threw the Afghan cover over my head, and through a large hole I kept open, I watched as the apparition reached the landing. It appeared to duck down 4 times as if it was to see if I was lying in my bed. Then, he vanished through the door into the next room. But the story doesn't end here. Months later, I set up a tape recorder in the room next to mine, and upon playing it back, a girl said, "Where's my mother?" And it was distinct. In June 2009, mediums came to visit us, and almost right away, they wanted to see the creek next to our property. They returned and they told us what was happening. Many decades before this, a young girl drowned in the creek, her family hiding in the house, but never showing themselves. A woman walks the floor upstairs, and she appeared to have perished from advanced consumption or something of that nature. The man who I'd seen was a farmer who was angry that we were living in his home. No names were given, and the only evidence that they had was a photograph of the girl in the kitchen window. She was sporting red hair, which was braided, and an unseemingly bluish face. The mediums did mention that there was something lurking outside that could only step onto the property every once in a while, and it wasn't good. Also, the stairway appeared to be a vortex where things could come and go, possibly explaining the sightings. For the most part, that was the end of my experiences, but the story didn't end there. In 2019, 10 years after the mediums came to see us, I had a dream one night where the girl told me my family will be moving. I actually took the dream seriously because the mediums told me I was supernaturally sensitive and that these things may come to me. Mom and Dad didn't appear to think much of it because they were quite happy living there, and they had been for over 30 years. About a year or 2 after that, I had another dream, which was far more profound. I had dreamed that I was walking down a dirt road, and what appeared to be in the distant past, I came upon our old house, which looked like a shack in the middle of nowhere, and where an old man was chasing hens in the front yard. An old woman dressed in period clothing came to my right side and said to me quite clearly, "Yeah, old Jacob Meyer is an ordinary man." The name stuck out to me, so at the time I was doing ancestry research online as I had little else to do in my free time. Using the subscriptions that I had, I plugged in the name Jacob Meyer, and to my shock, I discovered an obituary in my county. The obituary read that old man Jacob Meyer was a pioneer in this county. He'd lived here since the 1850s and lived 1 mile east of the nearest settlement. He had suffered a debilitating stroke and perished a few days later in 1896 in his home. My county had public access to various maps, which I immediately pulled up to the website. I discovered that our old house, 1 mile east of the nearest town, was indeed once owned by Jacob Meyer. Perhaps the stroke explained his weird movements whenever I saw him. As for his wife Martha, She must have been the one who passed away of advanced consumption, and the one who I, on Saturday morning, awakened to hear gasping for air. In 1906, she passed away in the house. I found her death certificate through my research. Her listed cause of death was advanced consumption, which was listed in Spanish. I never did receive full disclosure on the girl and her family. However, the original voice message that said 5 years toll was correct, and that my family suffered miserably in many ways for a period of 5 years. And worse still, my father ended up passing away of a stroke in 2022, and my mom had to move out of the house, for it was becoming too hard to not see him. When the realtors posted pictures online of the house, I immediately looked at them, and of course, I saw the little girl standing in the kitchen door looking out. To end the story, the house was about a half-mile from the oldest cemetery in our county, and I once went there to find the headstone for Jacob and Martha Meyer. I did end up finding both, which were in a dilapidated and crumbling state. Sometime later, Mom went with me as she wanted to see it out too. I remember exactly where it was, and when we came upon the stone, it had been replaced with a new one. That cemetery, by the way, was for many years being watched over by a tree that appeared to have an extremely scary face in its trunk. My friend once took several pictures of it, and the photos all came out solid gray. I don't know exactly what's going on in my county, but what I can say is that haunted history haunts me. I live in Arkansas, and I lived here a majority of my life. I've had experiences in all types of forms, whether it be UFO sightings, ghosts, demons, and that includes the Hab Man. The occasional sleep paralysis or a dream in another dream that I couldn't wake up from either. Those are other stories though. I want to tell you about the current duplex I've been living in, and it's been almost a year now. The events that I'm going to tell you aren't in any particular order, because I don't really keep up with dates or times, but it all happened in the first time I moved in. They say when a place looks appealing and it draws you close, it's because of an entity. Although I'm not really bothered by them, I just simply ignore them. I still decided I wanted to live at this duplex since it was nice. It was a 3-bed, 2-bath, and after signing all the paperwork, I came in the first week of July. I always clean my places with the doors open because I'm super superstitious. Well, this time, I was completely alone when I started hearing loud banging on my hallway walls. This happened in broad daylight, and I just ignored it because I had a feeling. Another time, about a month later probably, after I moved everything into my new place, the kids were finally home, including the dad. I say the dad because we're divorced, but he helped me move in. He was on the couch sleeping while I was organizing my stuff in my bedroom, and then my doorbell rang. I thought it was odd because I'd only recently moved in and I wasn't expecting any company, but my son and I heard it, so we were both confused. I went to open the door and nobody was outside. I instantly closed it because I do believe an entity can enter your door if you open it. During my time living here, I've heard up to 3 entities. I think they're in my attic mostly, or on the other side I would hear footsteps all over, day and night. There was a time when my neighbor was gone for about 2 to 3 months, and I would hear music, like entities opening and closing doors, talking, laughter, even turning on his showers. I even saw the neighbor's porch light turning on and off. I was so scared that one time I asked my best friend Maya to come stay the night with me. That night especially, it seemed like it was going to be peaceful, but how wrong I was. We heard both doors closing, banging, and like the neighbor was throwing a party. Maya even said when we went to bed, she heard banging on the windows in the guest room. I was dead asleep, and I didn't hear anything that night, other than the earlier noises before bedtime. Afterwards, I'd come home from work, and instantly hear footsteps or banging in the attic while I was in my room. Often, I would hear it in the kids' room. I didn't mention it, but the duplex is also brick, so I shouldn't hear anything in the kids' closet or mine. Sometimes I would stay alone, and I would hear banging extremely hard on the back door. This door is glass, so you can imagine how loud it was. I stayed frozen before checking the door. There was nobody there. I would also hear footsteps on my porch with nobody outside when I would check. I've even told my kid's father, who didn't believe it until he heard banging one night around 9 p.m. Fast forwarding a bit again, around February, my brother said I should sage the place. I didn't even think it would work, which it didn't, because during the time I started saging with prayer, the entity just followed me. I felt the presence of it just mocking me, and it didn't want to leave this place even though I saged it 4 times. From what I've heard, saging the place also angers the spirit, and it seemed to do exactly that. My neighbor finally came back at one point, and the entity was still here. I heard it dragging something heavy, as if it put someone in a box and was bringing it across the floor. When I would hear my neighbor snoring, and the walls were pretty thin, I would hear the entity dragging something heavy again, or even the loud footsteps in the attic area. The entity would follow me back when I was alone, and it'd follow me all the way to the kitchen or to my bedroom. One night, I experienced sleep paralysis and felt the energy of these 2 entities. I could feel that one was female because I heard her speaking to me, but since I just kept fighting them, I couldn't really make out what she was trying to say. During spring break, my kid's father took them on a trip to Florida for the week. I'm not sure why I wasn't in a deep sleep that night, because I looked at the time and it was 3:40 a.m., but I instantly knew what woke me up. I laid awake trying to go back to sleep, but I heard my laundry door close. The laundry door is in the middle of the place in my hallway. I get goosebumps every time I tell someone this story, and I told my little sister about it, who obviously said it could have been the wind. Back in September, during my niece's birthday weekend, I had my older sister come over to stay the night. Cynthia heard nothing, which was fine, so obviously she didn't believe me. But fast forward to this month, I kept telling her about the place, and I would ask her if she was so sure she didn't sense anything. She came over again recently, just to hang out all day, and I decided to tell her more about what was happening here. While I was outside smoking, just talking away, she got goosebumps all over her body. She felt extremely cold and now believes me. She said the entity wouldn't leave her alone and kept touching her arm and leg. I believe that the entity followed us inside, and she felt like it was a man who seemed evil and was mocking us. To this day, it hasn't left us, but I think it's best that I move out as soon as possible. I had a weird experience when I was in the shower at home. We didn't live here long, and as a child, I was taking a shower and getting a weird feeling of being watched. I got out and put on a towel and started to dry off, but I had a feeling to look at the keyhole in the door. I looked at it, and there staring at me was an eyeball. The weird thing was that it didn't look to be outside of the door looking through the keyhole. It was in the keyhole. I jumped up and got dressed quickly, telling my mother. Later, she told me, after talking to the last owner had a son who liked to watch people in the bathroom. He had passed away recently. About 9 years ago, right after my husband and I were settled into the married life, we moved into this duplex apartment building. There were 3 different apartments that were all connected to one another. The first being a studio, the middle being a bedroom, and the third being a 2-bedroom. For the first few months, we stayed in the studio apartment with the promise of the 1-bedroom as soon as it would open up. While we were in the studio, everything was fine. It wasn't until we moved into the 1-bedroom apartment when things started to get really weird. For the first week, I began to notice that the number 666 was randomly popping up in my daily life. At first, I would pass it off as a coincidence. That is, until things really started to go downhill. My mood began to change, and I was becoming angered very easily, beginning to lash out on my husband. But we didn't start to understand what was going on until whatever it was that was controlling me finally took over. It started with sleep paralysis. One night, I was laying in bed and could see a black cloaked figure descending onto me from the ceiling. I did everything in my power to move or scream in order to wake myself up. I ended up managing to scream in my sleep, with my husband waking me up after hearing me. Unfortunately, that was too late. The next night was when I physically attacked my husband. The next part is from what he told me, because I don't have any recollection of what happened. While he was asleep, I woke him up by physically hitting him. When he went to face me to try to figure out what was going on, the first thing he noticed was that my eyes were glossed over and that I was smiling. I then apparently laid back down and immediately began to snore like I was asleep the whole time. My husband was always a believer of the paranormal, so he ended up grabbing the spare sage he had on hand and began blessing everything. The next morning, I woke up with a major headache, sick to my stomach, and I was completely confused. When my husband explained what happened to me, I put everything else that had happened the week together. We didn't experience anything else at that apartment, but clearly that was enough for me.